Welcome to MSP After Hours, where we say the quiet part out loud. Let's get started. If a prospect is comparing you to the cheap MSP down the street, the problem probably isn't your price. The problem is they think you all are the same. And that's uncomfortable for a lot of MSP owners to hear because it's easier to blame the market. It's easier to blame cheap competitors, break-fix shops, or the guy who says he can manage everything for half the price. But if a prospect believes those options are even remotely comparable, then somewhere in the conversation, the difference between you and them was never made clear. When buyers think two things are similar, they use price to decide. That's human nature. If two trucks look the same, two TVs look the same, two service providers sound the same, people naturally gravitate towards the cheaper option. That's not irrational behavior. That's exactly what you would expect someone to do when the value difference hasn't been made obvious. So when MSP owners say things like, "We keep losing deals to cheaper competitors," the real question isn't why the competitor is cheaper. The real question is why the prospect thinks you two are in the same category. The comparison usually starts long before pricing is ever discussed. It begins with how we describe what we do. A lot of MSPs sound almost identical when they talk about their services. They say things like managed IT, 24/7 monitoring, help desk support, cybersecurity, and proactive maintenance. None of those things are wrong, but every MSP says them. Every website says them. Every proposal says them. So, from the client's perspective, the message becomes blurry. They hear that you manage IT. They hear that the other company manages IT. They hear that you both monitor systems, handle tickets, and install security tools. The language overlap so much that it creates the impression that you're simply two versions of the same thing. Once that perception exists, the buyer's brain does what it always does when two options feel similar. It simplifies the decision, and the easiest way to simplify the decision is price. Most business owners are not experts in technology. They're not comparing EDR platforms or backup solutions in their spare time. They're running businesses. They have payroll to meet, customers to serve, and 100 other decisions demanding their attention. So when they evaluate an MSP, they rely on shortcuts. If two providers appear to offer the same outcome, price becomes the deciding factor. That's not because they don't value IT. It's because they don't yet understand the differences between what you provide and what the cheaper provider is offering. If the difference hasn't been made clearly defined, the buyer fills in the gaps themselves. And unfortunately, when buyers fill in those gaps, they often assume everything is roughly the same. Once that assumption forms, price becomes the lens through which the entire decision is made. One of the biggest mistakes MSPs make is leading with tools instead of philosophy. We start talking about EDR, backups, monitoring software, and patch management. We list features in long proposals, and we describe the stack in technical detail, but tools don't differentiate you. Another MSP can buy the same tools tomorrow. What actually separates one MSP from another is the philosophy behind how those tools are used, the standards that guide decision-making, and the expectations set for the relationship. If those things aren't communicated clearly, the buyer defaults to the simplest comparison available. And again, the simplest comparison is price. Once we realized this, the next question became obvious. How do you actually demonstrate that you're different? Because a lot of MSP coaches and talking heads tell you that you need differentiation. They say that you need to position yourself differently or communicate your value, but they rarely show you what that actually sounds like in a real conversation. One of the easiest ways to separate yourself is to stop describing what you do and start describing what you require. For example, we make it very clear that we don't manage outdated technology. If a company has equipment that is well past its life cycle, we're going to recommend replacing it. Not because we want to sell hardware, but because outdated systems create instability, downtime, and security exposure. That immediately separates us from providers who just say yes to anything just to win the deal. Another example is administrative privileges. In our environment, end users don't run with admin rights. Over the years, we've learned that giving everyone administrative controls creates more problems than it solves. That's not a software decision, that's an operational philosophy. You can also differentiate through how you approach cybersecurity. Some providers treat security like it's an optional add-on, something you bolt on to the stack if the client asks for it. We don't approach it that way. For us, cybersecurity is foundational. It's built into how the environment is structured from the beginning. If someone tells us they're not that concerned about cybersecurity, that's usually a sign that we're probably not a good fit. Again, that's not a pricing conversation, that's a philosophy conversation. Another powerful way to show differentiation is through the expectations you set for the relationship. Many MSPs bend over backwards trying to say yes to everything because they're afraid of losing the deal. But sometimes the strongest signal you can send is the willingness to say no. When you say something like, if you're looking for the cheapest MSP, we're probably not going to be the right fit. You're not just filtering prospects, you're communicating confidence in your model, and confidence changes how people perceive value. Another way MSPs can separate themselves, and this one is often overlooked, is by having clear methodologies for how their services were designed in the first place. Most MSP service stacks didn't happen by strategy, they happened by accumulation. A tool gets added because a vendor pitched it, another tool gets added because a client asked for it, something else gets added because another MSP said it was a good idea. Over time, the stack grows, but there's no real narrative behind why those tools ever existed in the first place. That's where methodology becomes powerful. When we talk to prospects, we explain that our managed services weren't built randomly. They were built intentionally. We'll say something like, look, we could come in here and tell you our services were designed specifically for your business. Every MSP says that. But how could we actually prove that? Then we explain the strategy. Over the past several years, we started noticing cyber reliability insurance applications getting longer and longer. More questions, more controls, more requirements. That's not happening by accident. Cyber insurance companies are allergic to risk. They're not making those questions up just to fill space on a form. Those questions come directly from where businesses have been compromised. Insurance companies have data on where organizations are getting hit and what controls were missing when attacks succeeded. So we made a decision. Instead of guessing what security measures businesses should prioritize, we built our service framework around the controls those insurance companies are asking about. Because if the organizations insuring millions of dollars in cyber risk want to know whether these controls exist, that tells you something's important. It tells you where the real risk lives. So our approach wasn't a shotgun strategy where we throw tools into a stack and hope they work. It was intentional. We designed our services around the controls that determine whether a business is insurable. And when you explain that to a prospect, the conversation changes. Now you're not just another IT provider listing software tools. You're demonstrating that your service model was built around strategy, and strategy separates you from the guy down the street faster than any list of features ever will. Once those philosophical changes are clear, something interesting happens. The comparison changes. The prospect is no longer deciding between two MSPs that sound identical. They're deciding between two completely different approaches to technology and business risk. One provider might focus primarily on reactive support and low cost. Another might focus on standards, security posture, and long-term business resilience. Those are not the same services, even if both companies use the phrase managed IT. When the difference becomes clear, the cheap competitor stops being the benchmark because the buyer now understands they are choosing between two different philosophies, not two versions of the same thing. Cheap competitors will always exist. There will always be someone willing to do the work for less. That's not a problem you can eliminate. But the real goal isn't to eliminate cheap competitors. The real goal is to make sure that your clients never believe you're one of them. When the difference is clear, price becomes a secondary consideration. When the difference is unclear, price becomes the entire decision. And if prospects keep comparing you to cheaper MSPs, the problem probably isn't the cheap MSP. The problem is that you didn't create enough separation from them. See you next time.